Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
Today we're talking about 1883, the Yellowstone prequel that aired earlier this year on Paramount Plus. And my guest is the lead editor, Chad Galster. Chad, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Listeners, just a warning, spoilers are possible. So, Chad, I know you have a history with the creator of the show, Taylor Sheridan, who folks who may not be aware, he's written some of my favorite things. And as his career has progressed, talk to me about how you guys met and what you guys did together.
We met in kind of a random way. You know, I spent the first good chunk of my career, first 12, 15 years, cutting documentary and reality television. You know, when I got out of school, those were the jobs that were available to me. And I landed in some great spots, some really long-term gigs. And so what happened was during season 1 of Yellowstone, Taylor was editing Yellowstone. He had 2 editors and they needed some help. And so a guy that I met on The Hills, which was an MTV series popular in the mid to late 2000s.
I remember it.
Yeah. It kind of had its moment. Well, a friend of mine that I met there and I'd known ever since is a documentary reality editor. Had just coincidentally known Taylor Sheridan for 20 years. They were just friends. And then when Taylor started to make Yellowstone, my buddy went and started working for him. And so when Taylor asked him, you know, do you know any editors? He gave him my name. And I flew out to Park City, Utah, which is where Yellowstone was shooting at the time. The sound stages were there. They've since moved everything to Montana. And I met him and we just like hit it off professionally and as people. I remember that I cut a scene, sort of complicated, like 6-person dialogue scene. I only had a few hours to do it, and he watched it, and he said, "Okay." And he was directing, so he went back out to keep shooting. And then I went over to his house for dinner that night, and he's like, "Look, we don't know each other, but I'm impressed." And I was like, "Great, I love everything that you do." And we just started working together, and then very quickly I became Taylor's finishing editor. And so it was in an unofficial capacity, not named that way, but just sort of what happened. So either I would cut a scene for Yellowstone, or if someone else did, I would work with Taylor and do the final version. And we've just continued that way ever since. So I've done all 4 seasons of Yellowstone with him. I did a film that he directed that came out last year called Those Who Wish Me Dead, starring Angelina Jolie. We did a television series called Mayor of Kingstown with Jeremy Renner and 1883. And so since that day that I met him, I have worked exclusively for him. And so we're going on 5 years now, I think, if my math is correct. And it's been the highlight of my professional life. I mean, he's just, again, he just does stuff that I find fascinating. He writes stuff that I find fascinating. And I enjoy working with him. And so that's kind of how we do it on every show. I usually always do the first episode, usually the last episode, if it works out the way, and then a number in between. And so, yeah, we've just built this relationship and continue to work together rather fruitfully. So, and it continues. I'm going into Yellowstone season 5 with him in a little bit.
Well, Chad, give me a sense how having this kind of relationship over time does impact the editing. In other words, there's the skill of actually editing it, but certainly that relationship and knowing each other as well as you do and having done so many projects, how does that play out when you're editing something new?
Yeah, it makes things move so much faster, especially in a show like, so Taylor he's been horseback his entire life. Like, you know, he writes from a place of genuine authenticity. So for a show like Yellowstone or 1883, there's a lot of like very horse specific mechanics that to a layperson would be unnoticeable, but like to someone like him and to his friends and to the people that work on these shows, they're very specific. And so having worked with him for years, I've learned a lot about riding horses and just horses in general, rodeos, horse shows, different types of competitions. So when I put a scene together that contains, you know, those kinds of elements, it just means that I'm going to get it right, you know, 95% of the time, where it would have been like a 50-50 or worse before. And so it just saves everybody time. You know, the schedules that we make these shows on are pretty aggressive. That was certainly the case with 1883. We just did not have a lot of time. It was a really, really tight production schedule. And I think we started shooting in August and we were on the air in December. And, you know, the first script was written in April. So for a show of this magnitude, it's an uncommonly fast schedule. And then even aside from like the horse mechanics, just like understanding how he likes things put together. I think part of the reason why we've had a successful working relationship is because we saw things the same way, mostly the same way to begin with, and then you work with someone, you read their mind after a while, and we're at the mind reading stage for the most part. I mean, every once in a while he'll surprise me with a note. I think he'll love something and he hates it, or vice versa. So that's that's always going to be the case, but we see things pretty much the same way, and that just helps us be very efficient when we need to be.
Let's dive deeper then into 1883. This show takes an interesting choice that it utilizes a flash forward episode 1 right out of the gate. As an editor, talk to me about your perspective of using this both as a technique and then for 1883 specifically, what you're trying to achieve there.
It's a pretty common technique, right? And it just, like the how did we get here thing. And so what we start with is a very intense I guess an attack that our main character is witnessing and that she becomes a part of. And it does a couple of things. One, and this is just what it does in general when movies use it. It says, hey, there's something really exciting / terrifying / horrific that's about to come. And so it just grabs people, and it's a promise. It means that you can take your time setting up the rest of your show after the flash forward, because the audience knows it's like, okay, there's some exposition here. Maybe we've got to, maybe this is moving a little slow, but we're going to get to that part at some point, and that's exciting. And I really want to see how we got to that point. And so especially with our character who we meet there, and she's this like grizzled warrior, really what you see when in the flash forward. And then when you meet her, when you go back into where we actually begin our proper story, she's this like wild-eyed, naive, fresh-faced girl who has no idea, like about battle or anything. Anything. She's just lived in one place her entire life and wants to see the world. I think that it was written into 1883. Sometimes those types of flash forwards are found in editorial, and sometimes they're found when you discover that your show isn't all that exciting, and so it can be used as a crutch for sure. Sometimes it's planned. In this case, it was very much planned. It was part of the original structure when the whole thing was written. And it takes us a while. I mean, it's a 10-episode series, and we don't pay off that scene until episode 9. And so it takes us a while to get there. But it tells you some things about where the character is going to go. I think it engages you. It tells you some things visually about what we're going to do. It tells you some things about about the authenticity of what we're depicting. I think that in our case, it's a short scene. It's maybe 3.5 minutes, but it just tells you a lot about where you're headed. And from my experience, and it's tough to say, like being in this role, but I find it captivating, and the feedback that we've gotten is that I think a lot of other people found it to be that as well. And it's good and bad. It just people form some opinions about it, but again, it was a window into our story, and I think it benefited us quite a bit. So I'm proud of that sequence. I'm proud of what it does for the show.
Now, when you're doing a flash forward sequence, particularly in this larger context, how do I say it? Is there anything different about how you edit it? In other words, what you're going to show or the pacing of it, that you would take a different approach than you would when the scene actually happens, like you said in episode 9.
Yeah, there are. I mean, what's interesting about where it ended up is that it is largely, in the flash forward as it's presented in episode 1, is largely the edit that exists in episode 9 when we see the actual scene. But what you would do normally, and we do some of this, is make it more hyper real in the beginning. So whereas the scene might just play out in straight time when it's presented in the episode that it comes from, you could be more artful, impressionistic, and the flash forward opens on a 1 and 45-second shot of her face, of Isabel's face, Isabel May playing Elsa, and within that we cut out the horrific images that she's seeing. And so you can play around with it more, because really what you're trying to do is establish a feeling. The audience has no way to contextualize within the story what they're seeing. So you're just trying to create a series of emotions and some like just gut reactions to the violence, or the whatever she's seeing. So I think that's the main difference, is that you can really just play around and have fun with the footage that you have, and then later on you tell the scene in a more straightforward way, because it's fitting into, like, you understand it's part of a plot now, and so you engage it that way.
Another technique that you did with 1883 is the use of a voiceover, where the Elsa Dutton character, besides being our main character, she's also our narrator. And every episode we hear her sort of set up and close out what's happening. And talk to me, was that part of Taylor's plan from the beginning as well, or how does that come together? And again, as an editor, how do you edit to that?
Sure. Very much part of his plan from the beginning. And it's interesting, voiceover in the long history of film and television, it's had its place, and then it was like kind of passe, and then it was really like reviled, and it's a polarizing element. Some people really like it and some people hate it, and we had a lot of both on 1883. We had a lot of the, oh, I love this, and a lot of the I hate it, but even a lot of the I hate it's turned into I get it and I love it by the end of it. Because when you realize, I mean, spoiler of all spoilers, like, she's speaking from the grave the entire time. So what a lot of viewers said, in the beginning, feedback that we would get, or just, comments that we would get, is, she has way too much information. This doesn't make any sense. And then by the end, they're like, oh my God. And then their tears as the end of the series happens. And like, I get it now. She was talking to us from the grave the entire time. That's why she has all of this information. That's why she has this perspective. So it was a vital element in 1883. And I think, rather poetically done. I'm a very biased audience for it, because because of just this. Like, I work on the show. I love Taylor's writing, and I loved it from the beginning. And I actually, when I read 1883, I wasn't sure that she died. Like, I kind of read it just as an audience member. I knew that some of the things that he was toying around with as far as the narrative of the show, but I wasn't positive that she died. And so, when how do you do it as an editor? I mean, what's interesting is that we would play it back on set sometimes to make sure that we were covering enough of what, getting enough material. So if you wanted like one long shot to play over some voiceover, Isabel recorded all of it, and she actually, over the course of making 1883, she recorded it a number of times. But we always had at least a scratch track playing on set to make sure that we were just like, that our shots were long enough, like just as simple as that. It's mostly not necessary to do that, because you end up shooting enough material to cover as much time as you want usually. But in oneers and things like that, we made sure that we did it. And then speaking to why she recorded it multiple times, what was interesting is that she recorded it before we had shot anything. And then she recorded it again at the end after we had shot everything, and a few times in between. And it was really interesting to hear how her performance changed. And sometimes we're using that very first take, that very first performance, and sometimes we're not. And I don't even remember anymore I remember a few examples specifically, but it allowed Taylor and me and the other editors involved to get very specific about how we wanted that performance, what was the most effective performance. And even just going from being this wide-eyed, naive girl into who she is at the end. She is such a talented actress that she went through a lot of that journey on her first performance, her first read through of the narration. But there's no doubt that like the experience of doing the show added to that performance, especially in those later episodes when she's seeing the entirety of what's going to happen to her. So yeah, a really vital element for us, but one that did not come without a little bit of not controversy, but just like commentary from our audience of like, oh my God, and then like, oh my God. I think very proud of how that paid off as well.
It's playing with expectations somewhat. Now, because of the streaming world we live in, I actually haven't had the opportunity to watch Yellowstone. Is voiceover an element in that show as well? Or is that just for 1883?
Just for 1883, it's not an element that and we don't really, 1883 is interesting. That it's a self-contained story. We're going to, this has been announced that the next season, quote unquote, of 1883 will be, I think it's 1932 or something. We're gonna engage the Duttons in a different point in their history. I have no idea if narration is going to be part of that, but it worked very well and very uniquely for 1883's story because of what happens with our character. But Yellowstone, we don't do it. We do flashbacks in Yellowstone, but we don't do narration.
Chad, something you mentioned in passing triggered another question for me, and that was that you're playing the voiceover on set to make sure that the shots are long enough. But talk to me as an editor, do you spend a lot of time on the sets when you're working?
Usually, no. On 1883, I did. I was there a lot. And part of why I was there so much was just because I was editing the show in Los Angeles, where I live. And then, Taylor was on set all the time. And to just to work with him, I traveled to where they were shooting. And so the real wonderful part of that is I developed relationships with a lot of the principal cast. And that was really fun. And I would get to show them first cuts of things or sometimes second, third cuts of things, whatever. But, and it was all whenever Taylor felt that it was important for them to see the work that they had done, whether or not just to do it for fun or whether it was going to inform a performance that they were about to shoot. So that was really exciting. We had, there was a lot of remote location work on 1883 for obvious reasons. And we had like a village of trailers for all of our crew. And I had one as well. We had an Airstream trailer that had an Avid in it and a bed. And so when I would go out there, we could work together. I could show him stuff and then he could go off and shoot some more and I could make changes. And then at night, that's where I slept. And so it was a interesting and very cool like group experience, right? We were all in that together. Some, Tim and Faith had a slightly nicer trailer than I did, put it that way, but as they should. But we were all like in it together, and it was very cool. So on a number of different occasions, I was out there. I was out there a lot in the beginning, like when we were shooting in Fort Worth on some of that stage work that we did, not stage work, like set work, where we built set extensions to some existing buildings and created the town of Fort Worth back in the day, and to when we were like in North Texas, kind of in the middle of nowhere shooting, and I was there for a lot of it. So it was unusual for an editor to I think be on location that much, especially nowadays during COVID. But it was a real thrill, and it was I think it just made me feel more connected to the material that we were shooting. It was fun to get to watch them shoot it firsthand.
I want to do a deeper dive into a specific scene, and that's in episode 4, where the wagon train needs to cross the river. Mm-hmm. Now, they do cross the river. It's quite disastrous.
Some of them do.
Exactly. And so as we said, we warned there would be spoilers. But I want to talk about the decisions from an editing perspective on how this scene came together.
Yeah, that scene was really interesting because I think what ended up on screen is what Taylor had envisioned for it, but it wasn't necessarily the case that was going to work. It was, so the sequence itself was actually really complicated, and we shot it over 2 days with 6 cameras. For those that hopefully everyone that's listening to this has seen it, because I've already told them that Elsa dies. But if anyone for some reason hasn't seen it, the scene is Elsa playing the Moonlight Sonata on the piano, and then we have these little flashes of the river crossing as it's happening, with no sound from the river crossing itself. We only ever hear the piano, and then we're flashing back to these images of struggle and horror. So what we did to capture that was to spend 2 days and shoot the whole thing straight. Like there was an edit that I made of just the entire river crossing as a scene with sound and production sound and all that stuff. We had every bit of it. We had it in spades. I mean, in 2 days, you can accomplish quite a lot. And it was a complicated sequence, which is why we had to do it in 2 days. But we had the whole thing. And so the first thing that I did was to assemble the whole river crossing, just like if we wanted to play it straight, here it is. And it was, made like a 7 or 8 minute sequence out of it that was dramatic and exciting. And so we always knew that we had that to fall back on. But what Taylor really wanted to do was what we did, which is to have, separately, I cut this sequence of just Elsa playing the piano and just playing that straight as a scene. Then took that sequence of Elsa playing the piano and started to sprinkle in these little bits of imagery. And that was so much fun because the first, how do you get into it? Well, what we decided was the first image of the river crossing that we have is Thomas, LaMonica Garrett's character, jumping into the water. And it's like, oh my God, what's happening? We're underwater and this guy's jumping in and he's clearly frantically trying to do something. And then you start seeing people, splashing and drowning. And you see like horses trying to get through the water and wagons. We keep coming back to it. It took a long time to settle on the sequence as it aired. But it was like playtime. It wasn't like arduous time. It was like, man, we could do this so many different ways. And
Chad, let me insert quickly, just for
yeah,
people who haven't seen it and are asking
yeah,
themselves, what the hell?
yeah,
Our wagon train has abandoned a lot of their large furniture because it's not going to be able to get across the river, and it
that's right.
includes this piano that they've been carrying. And our Elsa character, who's with the cattle, comes along and stops with the furniture. She's
Right.
not at the edge of the river playing the piano
It's
while
an
people
important
are
point to
drowning.
make.
So,
Yeah, she's
but
very
just
much in a different location. And so we are, as an audience, experiencing her piano performance, but she has no idea that all these people are dying. It would be an odd thing for a person to play music to if they were there to see it. But she has what the piano is for her is the loss of her old life, right? I mean, she's it's a very emotional scene for her, even not knowing that what's happening with the river crossing, because it's this last, in her mind, might be the last time she ever plays a piano. And so the characters are all experiencing this loss in different ways. And so there's that, it ties the two different elements together thematically quite beautifully. But it was what we it's a lot of people that were involved in the production, producers and all, had different ideas about how that sequence should go. Everyone had different, it's such a hard thing to shoot, and you have to spend a lot of money to make a sequence like that. The show was expensive to begin with. So, but ultimately Taylor and I settled on what he wanted to do artistically, and he had the support of the studio to ultimately put on screen what his vision of the sequence was. So I'm really proud of how it turned out, because people tend to, the feedback that I've gotten from is that people, it's a very emotional thing, but I think it was because we had all of the elements at our disposal to make it what we wanted to be. Yeah, it was a tricky one, and it was hard to let go of, like, the sequence. I mean, the actual just like straight cut of that is really cool, and only a few of us have ever seen it. So in some ways, I wish our audience could see it. But I think emotionally, where it landed is the exact way that it was supposed to be.
I also like the way that the piano music, like she's playing the Moonlight Sonata earlier, and then when she crosses with the cattle, it's no longer the Moonlight Sonata, but we are getting a keyboard rendition of the theme music
Right.
going well, and we are actually, and here we are hearing some noise, but muted, of them crossing, and so it still ties in without a jarring cut on that. I was really impressed.
All very specifically done. Brilliant composers, Brian Tyler and Brett and Vivian, both of whom do Yellowstone as well. Just brilliant guys. And we've all worked together now for a lot of years, and just in putting that together, I get to talk to Brett does a lot of the kind of nuts and bolts scene specific work. And so I just we talked a lot about that. He had that idea. It made perfect sense. And the execution of it, I thought, was really beautiful. By the way, worth noting, just when you say, like, Elsa playing, it actually is her playing. Like, every note of that was played by Isabel May. She learned that piece of music, and all of the sound there is what we recorded in the field. Like, it was pointless because it's so specific, and she fumbles sometimes, as you would expect from like a somewhat novice player, especially having the emotional experience that she's having. And I remember when I showed her that sequence for the first time, and I said, this is all you. And I was actually proud of her, and I hope she's proud of that as well, that it's her playing literally on set, on the day, every note that you hear.
Now, early in the episode, there's a scene where the Duttons take their wagon across. It's actually a night crossing over the same river. Talk to me about how these two scenes fit together.
Well, it's important structurally for the narrative, because you get to see what it looks like when it goes well. And it also establishes that it is quite dangerous. I mean, and in that night sequence, so our primary family, the Duttons cross at night. Because James Dutton, Tim McGraw's character, is concerned that if they wait till morning, that their equipment they could lose their wagons, their horses. So he wants to be available to help the next day, but wants to get his family across safely first. And so that's why he does it. Makes a lot of sense. And so what we get to see is how deep the river is. There's we get to see him scouting the river, and he goes solo on horseback, and you see like his horse is like almost entirely submerged. So it shows our audience, like, this is what we're up against when we cross the river. We, as like the group at large. And then, you get to see how fast the water moves. You get to see how high the water rises up on the wagons. So it's really like, it establishes a baseline of what that experience should be, if it goes well, and just how hard it is for it to go well because of everything that they're up against. So it's really important narratively to see that first and to see them get through it. And interestingly, Faith Hill, we have, obviously it's a show with actors. We had stunt performers, but Faith Hill drove that wagon on that last take herself. And so what you see in the show is Faith Hill doing it. And they're both accomplished horse rider. I mean, Tim McGraw is a straight up cowboy. I mean, that man knows his way around horses. He's been horseback his whole life as well, as far as I know. Does a ton of his own stunts just because he's a very, very, very capable horseman. I think they both, hopefully, again, take a lot of pride in the fact that when you see what you're seeing on screen, it's mostly you can point to that and say, yep, that's Tim, that's Faith. They're really doing it out there. So unless there was something that was just too dangerous for it to make sense. So we didn't want anyone to get hurt, and thankfully no one did.
Well, we have tracketed some spoilers, but even if you haven't seen the show, there's still a lot there to explore, I think, for folks. And if people are listening to us fresh, then still a good reason to check it out. Chad, this was a lot of fun. We're going to call it a wrap here, but it's great having you.
Well, it was fun talking to you. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. It's a project that is very near and dear to my heart, so I'm always happy to share with people. And if you haven't seen it yet, yes, sorry for the spoilers, but I think there's still a lot there to be experienced. So I hope you enjoy it.
Listeners, check it out. And listeners, I'd also like to know what you think of these shorter podcast episodes. You'll find my contact info on our website, belowtheline1word.biz. That's B-I-Z. You'll also find past episodes and links to all of our social media, so check it out. Chad, you mentioned you're working on Yellowstone now. Mm-hmm. They have announced another season of 1883, although, as we said, it's going to be farther in the future. Anything else we should watch out for? Any other shout-outs on your side?
Well, there's going to be Mayor of Kingstown season 2. Taylor has so much stuff in the works. So the Taylor Sheridan universe, as some people have come to call it, is ever expanding. So there's a series called Tulsa King that stars Sylvester Stallone that's shooting now that'll be out. So you won't have to look far and wide to find something of his to watch. If you like his writing and like his storytelling, then we're here for you. We're going to be here for a while. Yellowstone, I think, is going to go on for a while. So.
Well, we'll watch for those. My shout-outs are for the regular bunch. Thanks to Curtis Five for our music, John Wan for our logo, and to all of our listeners, I appreciate you. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts and tell your friends. Thanks again from Below the Line.